The unlikely meeting, the rain had been falling since morning, soft at first, then heavier as the day went on. By late afternoon, the streets were quiet. The shop windows fogged and most people were inside. A young girl walked alone down the narrow sidewalk, her shoes damp, her coat a little too thin for the chill in the air. She was not looking for anything in particular, only somewhere dry to wait until the weather calmed. Her eyes caught the glow of a small, warm light from a shop across the street. It was an old music store, the kind that seemed forgotten by time, with instruments sitting behind glass that looked older than she was. She stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing softly. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and something dusty. Rows of violins hung along one wall, guitars leaned in neat lines, and in the far corner she saw a piano. It was an upright, the kind you might find in a school classroom decades ago. The wood was scratched and faded, and the keys were yellowed. On the front was a small tag that read, "For display only, the shopkeeper." An older man with gentle eyes noticed her looking. "Not for sale," he said quietly, walking over. "It's too damaged to tune, just here for decoration." She nodded politely, but her eyes stayed on the piano. Something about it pulled her in. Even though she had never played a single note in her life, almost without thinking, she stepped closer. Her fingers hovered over the keys, then rested lightly on them. The shopkeeper didn't stop her, so she pressed one key, then another. The sound was imperfect, slightly flat, a little uneven but warm. It didn't matter that the notes were not right. For some reason they seemed to fit her hands. She tried pressing a few more keys. Slowly, the sound echoed in the quiet shop. Soft and unhurried. It wasn't music, not yet, but something in her chest stirred. She looked up, almost shyly. But the shopkeeper was just watching with a small, curious smile. "You play?" he asked. She shook her head. "No," she said, "I've never had lessons." The man tilted his head slightly. "You touch the keys like you know them." She didn't know how to answer that. It was true she had never learned music. Her family couldn't afford instruments or classes, but she had always liked the sound of the piano on the radio. It was a sound that made her stop whatever she was doing. It made her feel something she couldn't explain. She stepped back, embarrassed. "Asta should go," she said. But the shopkeeper gestured to the bench. "Go ahead, sit for a moment." It felt strange, but she obeyed. Lowering herself onto the worn seat, her fingers returned to the keys. And this time, she pressed them with a little more courage. The tones filled the air again, broken, yet still beautiful. She didn't know why she stayed. Maybe it was the sound, or the quiet, or the way the piano seemed to be waiting for her. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows. The shop smelled of old wood and history in that moment. The rest of the world faded. It was just her and the piano. The shopkeeper leaned on the counter. He didn't interrupt. There was something unusual about this girl's touch. Not skill, she clearly had no training, but care. Every note seemed to mean something to her. He had seen many people walk past that piano without a second glance, yet here she was, drawn to it as if it had been made for her. After a while she stood. "Thank you," she said quietly, as if she had been given more than just a seat. The man nodded. She stepped back into the rain, but as she walked away, she kept glancing over her shoulder at the shop window. Through the glass, the piano sat alone again. She didn't know why it mattered, but she knew she would come back. That night, lying in bed, she thought about the sound of the keys. Not perfect, not polished, but warm and alive. It stayed in her mind long after the rain had stopped. Somehow, she felt the piano was calling her. And she had no idea that this small, forgotten instrument was about to change her life. Asterisk a life without music. The next morning, the sky was clear again, but the memory of the piano stayed with her like a soft echo. She went through her usual routine, helping her mother prepare breakfast, making sure her younger brother had his homework, then heading out for her shift at the small cafe on Main Street. Life in their town was quiet, predictable, and sometimes heavy. There wasn't much space for dreams, only the daily rhythm of work. School and bills at the cafe. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. She moved between tables, carrying trays, taking orders, and refilling cups. in the background. An old radio sat on the counter, playing music that was always just a little too soft to cover the clinking of dishes. She found herself pausing whenever a piano song came on, her ears catching every note. It was the same warm pull she had felt yesterday. Sitting at the shop's old upright, when her shift ended, she lingered outside, her feet turning toward the music shop without much thought. It was only a short walk away, and the idea of seeing the piano again made her heartbeat quicken in a way she couldn't explain. But when she reached the shop window, she hesitated. It felt silly to walk in just to touch the keys again, especially when she didn't know how to play. Still, she found herself stepping through the door, the bell above chiming like it had been expecting her. The shopkeeper looked up from behind the counter and raised an eyebrow. "Back so soon?" he asked. She smiled shyly, just passing by. Her eyes drifted toward the corner. And there it was, the piano, sitting quietly, as if nothing had changed. The man said nothing more, only nodded toward it. She took that as permission and walked over, running her fingers across the top before lowering herself onto the bench. She pressed a key, then another, the sound filling the room in the same uneven way. It didn't matter, it was still beautiful to her. She began tapping out a simple rhythm, something she'd heard on the radio earlier. It wasn't exact, but it was enough to make her feel like she was creating something. Even if only in her own way, time passed without her noticing. It was only when the shopkeeper cleared his throat that she realized how long she'd been there. "I should probably go," she said, standing up. "You can come back any time," he replied, his voice calm but warm, something about the way he said it made her believe he meant it. Over the next few weeks, visiting the shop became her quiet secret. Some days she stopped in for only a few minutes before work. Other days she stayed longer. She never asked for lessons, never pretended to know more than she did. She simply sat, pressed the keys, and let the sound fill her. She learned by listening, trying to copy simple tunes from memory, adjusting them to work with the keys that still played well. The broken notes didn't bother her. In fact, she liked the challenge of making something beautiful from something imperfect. Her family didn't know about her visits. They had too much on their minds already. Bills, repairs, school fees. An old piano in a dusty shop wouldn't have made sense to them, but for her it became the one place where the world felt quiet and open. The rest of the town might not notice her, but the piano it responded to her in a way she couldn't explain. Almost like it was breathing with her. One evening, after a long shift, she arrived to find the shop nearly empty. The light outside was fading, the windows reflecting the glow of street lamps. The shopkeeper was polishing a violin but looked up. When she entered without a word, he motioned toward the piano. She sat down, her fingers moving over the keys more confidently now. She still didn't know what she was playing, only that it felt right. When she finished, she looked up and found him watching closely. "You ever think about learning properly?" he asked. She shook her head. "Lessons cost money." The man was quiet for a moment, then said, "Not all lessons have to cost." She didn't answer, but something in her heart shifted. Maybe this wasn't just about pressing keys anymore. Maybe there was something here worth holding on to. As she left that night, the air was cool and the stars were out. She walked home with the faint sound of the piano still in her ears. The shop might have been small, the piano old and damaged, but to her, it had already become something rare, a place where she felt seen, and she knew without even planning it that she would keep coming back, again and again, until she understood why. The shopkeepers noticed by the third week her visits to the little music shop were no longer rare surprises. They were part of her days. Quiet as a secret and just as precious. She didn't knock or hesitate anymore. She simply stepped inside, and the bell above the door greeted her like an old friend. The shop smelled the same every time. Faint wood polish, a hint of paper from old sheet music, and the cool air from outside slipping in with her. The piano still sat in its corner. It scratched wood, catching the light in uneven ways, its keys still worn and uneven. The shopkeeper had noticed something from the very first time she sat there, the way her hands seemed to belong on those keys. At first he had told himself it was nothing, just a girl curious about a forgotten instrument, but curiosity didn't make someone return day after day. Curiosity didn't make someone lose track of time while playing broken notes that didn't lead to any real song. No, there was something else here, and he couldn't quite put it into words that afternoon. She arrived later than usual. The sky outside turning a soft gold, she had been working longer hours at the cafe. But even tiredness couldn't keep her away. She sat down at the piano without speaking, her fingers pressing a slow, wandering melody. The sound was imperfect, as always, yet it had a kind of warmth that made the small shop feel alive. The shopkeeper pretended to sort through a box of guitar strings. But really, he was listening. After a while he spoke. "Where did you learn to touch the keys? Like that?" She looked up, surprised. "I didn't learn anywhere," she said. "I just listen and try." He raised an eyebrow. "You've got a better ear than you think." She shook her head, smiling a little. "I can't even read music. That's not what I mean," he replied. "You don't just play notes. You make them mean something." His words stayed with her longer than she expected. No one had ever said anything like that to her before at home. Life was about doing what needed to be done. There wasn't much room for talk about meaning. But here, in this shop, with this old man and this damaged piano, it felt like there was space for it. The next day when she arrived, the shopkeeper had something waiting for her. It was a single sheet of beginner piano music, yellowed with age. "This is easy," he said, sliding it onto the piano stand. "Let's see what you can do," she hesitated, tracing the lines and dots with her eyes. "I told you, I can't read this. That's fine," he said. "I'll show you." He pointed to each note slowly, telling her which key to press. The first time through, it sounded uneven, the rhythm broken, but by the third try, melody began to form, simple, gentle, but real. Her hands stumbled at the changes, but she didn't stop when she reached the last note. She let it linger, listening to how it faded into the air, that the shopkeeper said quietly, "Is music." She looked at him, unsure whether to believe it. "Music's not about perfect keys or perfect timing," he added. "It's about what you make someone feel." She thought about that the whole walk home, the street lamps flickering on as the evening deepened over the next week. She practiced that small piece each time she visited. Her fingers grew faster, her ears sharper. Some days, she even tried changing the order of the notes, curious to hear what would happen. The shopkeeper never stopped her, only watched with that same small smile. One quiet afternoon, as she played, a woman came into the shop looking for a guitar. The girl kept playing softly while the shopkeeper helped the customer. When the woman left, she glanced at the girl and said, "That was beautiful." Before walking out the door, it was the first time a stranger had said anything about her playing. The girl felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from something else, pride, maybe, or hope. The shopkeeper noticed, too. "You see?" he said. "You've got something worth hearing." She laughed softly. "It's just an old piano with broken notes." "Maybe," he said, "but in the right hands, even broken things can be beautiful." From then on, she came not just to sit and play, but to learn. She didn't call them lessons, and neither did he. But every visit added something new, a chord, a rhythm, a way to make the music smoother and slowly, without her even realizing it. The shopkeeper's quiet attention was shaping her into someone who could really play. One evening, as she was about to leave, she asked, "Why keep this piano if it can't be fixed?" The shopkeeper paused before answering. "It belonged to a concert pianist a long time ago," he said. "It was damaged in a flood and written off as useless. But I kept it because I thought it still had a story left." She looked at the worn keys, her fingers itching to touch them again. She didn't say it out loud, but she wondered if maybe she was part of that story now. The first real song the shop was quiet that afternoon. Outside, a thin layer of snow had started to fall, soft flakes drifting past the window. She walked in with red cheeks from the cold, her scarf loose around her neck. The bell above the door rang gently, and the familiar warmth of the shop welcomed her in. The shopkeeper was tuning a guitar near the counter, but when he saw her, he nodded toward the piano. No words were needed anymore. She took off her gloves, sat down and placed her hands on the keys, The wood felt cool under her fingertips, the same as it always did for weeks. She had been practicing the little piece he had given her at first. It was nothing more than a line of notes she struggled to remember, but now it had shape. Her fingers no longer hesitated, and the gaps between notes had closed. She pressed the keys in smooth rhythm, letting the sound spill out into the empty shop. The old piano still had its flaws. Some notes stuck, others came out flat, but she had learned to work around them, skipping over certain keys, adjusting the melody so it still made sense. The imperfections didn't make the song weaker, they made it hers. The shopkeeper listened from his chair.
Yes.
He didn't interrupt, didn't correct her. When she reached the end, he simply said, "Again." She smiled faintly and began from the top, this time closing her eyes as she played. The melody filled the space between them, slowly. The music stopped sounding like practice and started sounding like something real. When she finished, the shopkeeper clapped softly. "That," he said, "is your first real song." She laughed under her breath. "It's not even perfect. It's not supposed to be," he replied. "It's supposed to be you." Something about those words stayed with her. She had never thought of music as something that could belong to her. It was always something distant, played by professionals, written by people with training and expensive instruments. But here she was, in a small-town shop, with an old piano that couldn't even be sold. And yet, somehow, she had made something that felt alive. She played the song again, slower this time. Her eyes traced the worn wood of the piano, the tiny scratches that told a story she didn't know. She imagined the hands that had played it before. Long ago, maybe they had been skilled. Maybe they had performed for crowds. And now, it was her hands keeping it alive as she played. A man stepped into the shop to escape the cold. He stood near the door, listening for a moment before walking over to the counter. "That's beautiful," he said quietly to the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper only nodded toward her, as if to say, "She's the one you should tell." The man smiled and called out, "Don't stop. It sounds wonderful." She felt her face warm. But she kept going until the song was done. When the man left, the shop felt even warmer than before. "That," the shopkeeper said, "is what music does. It reaches people, even strangers." She sat there for a moment, letting his words sink in. It wasn't about being perfect or fast or fancy. It was about making someone feel something over. The next few days, she returned again and again. Sometimes she played the song exactly as written. Other times she changed small parts, a different chord here, a longer pause there. The shopkeeper never stopped her, never said she was wrong. He only listened. As if each version was its own little story. One evening, she stayed later than usual. The snow outside had grown thicker, covering the streets in white. The shop was empty except for them, and the air felt still. She played her song one last time before leaving. Her fingers light and sure. When the last note faded, she rested her hands on the keys. "This one's mine now," she said softly. The shopkeeper nodded. It always was. She left with a small smile that night. The cold air didn't feel as sharp. The snow didn't feel as heavy in her mind. She carried the sound of that song, not as a piece of paper with notes, but as something that lived in her hands. Something she could take anywhere, even when the shop was closed. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. Her first real song was more than music. It was a doorway, and the steps she had taken through it would lead her to places she had never dared to imagine. The unwanted gift winter deepened over the town, the streets grew quieter, and the music shop felt even warmer by contrast for her. The piano had become more than just an instrument. It was a place to breathe, a place where the rest of the world faded. She didn't own it, but it felt like it belonged to her in some small, unspoken way. One gray afternoon, she arrived to find the shop quieter than usual. The shopkeeper was sitting at the counter, a piece of paper in his hand, and a thoughtful look on his face. He looked up and smiled faintly, but there was something different in his eyes. "You can play for a while if you'd like," he said. "I've just got some things on my mind." She sat down at the piano, but her fingers moved slower than usual. Something about his tone had settled in her chest. After a few minutes, she stopped and asked, "Is something wrong?" He hesitated before answering. "There's a collector who came by last week," he said. He's interested in buying the piano. The words landed like a weight she hadn't expected. She stared at him, unsure how to respond. It's been sitting here for years, he continued. Most people walk right past it. But this man wants it as a display piece in his home. She blinked. Trying to imagine the piano locked away in some rich man's living room, it felt wrong, like taking a bird that had just learned to sing and putting it in a glass case. That's good for you, though, right? She said quietly. He shrugged. It would help with the bills. She nodded. But the tightness in her chest didn't ease. She knew she had no right to feel this way. The piano wasn't hers. And the shopkeeper had kept it for years without anyone caring about it. But now it mattered, at least to her that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She tried to tell herself it wasn't a big deal. If it was sold, she'd still have her job, her family, her life, the same as before she'd ever touched the keys, but the thought of walking into the shop and seeing an empty corner made her stomach twist. The next day, she arrived at the shop earlier than usual. The piano sat where it always did. Silent and still, she sat down and began to play. Her song, slower than ever, letting each note hang in the air. It felt like she was saying goodbye even though nothing had happened yet. Shopkeeper listened from behind the counter, his hands folded. He could see the difference in the way she played, the heaviness in her touch, the way her shoulders curved forward. When she finished, she didn't look up right away. You really like this old thing, don't you? He asked softly. She nodded without speaking, her throat tight. I've had a lot of instruments pass through this shop, he said. Some stay for a week, some for years. But every now and then, one finds the right person. She looked at him, confused. What do you mean? He didn't answer directly, only stood and walked toward the piano, running a hand along its scratched surface. It's not much to look at, he said. But in the right hands, it's worth more than any collector could pay. The bell above the door rang. Breaking the moment, a customer stepped in, and the shopkeeper went to help them. She stayed at the piano, her hands resting on the keys but not playing. Her mind raced with the thought, what if this is the last week? What if tomorrow it's gone? When she finally left, the cold air outside felt sharper than usual. Snow crunched under her shoes, but she barely noticed. The walk home was a blur of streetlights and white drifts. Her thoughts circling the same fear she didn't want to lose. But she didn't know how to stop it. The following morning, she almost didn't go to the shop. She told herself she should start preparing for the change. But her feet carried her there anyway. When she stepped inside, the shopkeeper was already waiting. Before she could sit, he said, "Come with me." She followed him to the back room, where a dolly stood beside the piano. Her heart sank. This was it. But then he smiled in a way that softened his whole face. If you can help me move it, he said. It's yours. She blinked, sure she had misheard. What? He chuckled. I'm giving it to you, no charge. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Someone else might see it as broken, he said, but I've seen what you can do with it. Her chest felt too full to speak, so she simply nodded. They lifted and tilted, maneuvering the heavy instrument toward the door. Snow swirled in as they loaded it into the back of a borrowed truck. She climbed in beside it for the short drive, one hand resting on the cool wood as if afraid it might disappear. When they reached her small house, her family watched in surprise as the piano was carried inside. It barely fit in the living room. But to her, it looked perfect. For the first time, the piano had a home, and for the first time, she felt like it was truly hers. The first real home. The piano sat in the corner of the living room like it had always been there. Its dark wood stood out against the pale walls. Its presence seemed to make the small space feel fuller, warmer. At first, the family moved around it carefully, as if it were a guest they didn't quite know how to approach. Her younger brother would glance at it from the couch. Her mother would pass by it with a small shake of her head, half smiling at the surprise of it all. That first evening, she sat on the bench after dinner. The room was quiet except for the hum of the old heater. Her fingers touched the keys, and the sound filled the space differently than it had in the shop. Here it didn't echo against high ceilings. It wrapped itself around the room, settling into the corners like a soft blanket. Her siblings gathered without being asked. Drawn by the sound, she played her song. The one the shopkeeper had helped her learn. It was still imperfect, a few flat notes here and there. But no one seemed to mind. Her little sister leaned against. The piano sighed, eyes closed, listening like it was a story. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual. Before the house had fully stirred, she sat at the piano. The sunlight came through the thin curtains and fell across the keys, making them look less yellow and more like aged ivory. She played softly, careful not to wake anyone, the music becoming her quiet greeting to the day and the afternoons. She began to notice something. The neighbors sometimes slowed their steps when passing the front window. At first, she thought it was just curiosity about the piano, but then, one evening, as she played, she saw an older woman stop completely on the sidewalk, listening with her hands clasped when the song ended. The woman smiled through the glass and waved. It was a small gesture, but it made her realize her music was reaching beyond the walls of the house. Her mother didn't say much about the piano. At first, she had always been practical, focused on bills, groceries, and keeping the household running, but one night, as her daughter played softly in the background while she folded laundry, she paused. "That's nice," she said quietly. "It makes the house feel different." It was the closest thing to praise she had ever given about music, and it stayed with her over the next weeks. The piano became part of the family's rhythm. It wasn't locked away for special occasions. It was there for anyone to touch, though her siblings preferred to watch her play rather than try themselves. She learned to play small tunes for her brother when he was restless, gentle songs for her sister at bedtime. She even began experimenting with her own melodies. Little fragments that came to her while she washed dishes or walked home from work. The shopkeeper visited one Saturday afternoon. He stepped inside, taking in the sight of the piano in its new home. "It suits the place," he said with a nod. She played for him, a song he hadn't heard before. It wasn't from sheet music. It was hers entirely. A mix of old notes and new ideas. When she finished, he smiled. "You've made it your own." It felt strange to realize how quickly life had changed. Just months ago, she had only admired pianos from a distance. Now there was one in her living room, its presence shaping her days in quiet ways. When she came home tired from the cafe, she would sit at the keys before even taking off her coat. When she felt restless, she would play until her mind settled. It was as if the piano had become another voice in the house, one that spoke when she couldn't. The neighbors began to notice more often. Sometimes a knock would come at the door, and a neighbor would smile sheepishly. "Mind if I listen for a while?" She never said no. She had never imagined herself playing for anyone. But here she was, sharing music without planning it. On the coldest nights, the family would gather near the heater, her siblings wrapped in blankets, while she played quietly. In the background, those moments felt almost unreal, as if time had slowed just enough for her to see what she had. The piano wasn't perfect, and neither was life, but together they made something that felt whole. One evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, she stayed up. The street outside was silent, the snow glowing faintly under the street lamps. She played her song again, but slower, letting each note linger until it faded completely in the stillness. She thought about the shop, the day she first touched the keys, the way the shopkeeper had looked at her. It felt like a path had been placed under her feet without her even knowing it, and in that quiet moment she understood something. The piano hadn't just found a place in her home, it had found a place in her life. It was no longer a thing she visited in the corner of a dusty shop. It was part of her now, and she couldn't imagine the house without it. The hands it was made for years passed quietly. The piano stayed in the same corner of the living room, but the life around it changed. Her siblings grew older. Her work at the cafe shifted from long, tiring shifts to fewer hours as she took on something new. She had begun teaching, not in a big school or formal studio, right there in her living room. It started with a neighbor's child. One afternoon, a woman from down the street knocked on her door. Her son had heard her playing through the open window in summer and had been curious. The mother asked if she might give him a lesson or two. At first she hesitated, unsure if she could teach anyone when she had never been formally trained. But the boy's eager eyes reminded her of her own the first time she sat at the shop. Piano, she said. Yes, the first lesson was simple, just showing him the keys, letting him press them and hear the sounds. She told him the same thing the shopkeeper had once told her. It's not about perfect notes. It's about making them mean something. The boy came back the next week, and then again. Word spread. Slowly, and soon she had 3 students, then 5. Some were children. Some were adults who had always dreamed of playing but never started. Her living room, once just a quiet family space, now held the gentle noise of learning wrong notes, laughter, and the occasional cheer when a song came together. Through it all, the old piano kept its same scratches and worn keys. She had the chance to replace it once, when a friend offered her a newer instrument. But she couldn't do it. This piano had been her beginning. It had taught her patience, taught her how to listen, taught her how to believe she could make music at all. She couldn't imagine any other set of keys under her hands. The shopkeeper still visited now and then. His hair had grown whiter, his steps slower. But his eyes lit up every time he saw the piano in use. One summer evening, he came by, just as one of her young students finished a piece. The boy stood shyly while the shopkeeper nodded. "You've got a good teacher," after the boy left. The shopkeeper stayed a while, watching her play. When she finished, he said, "I was right about that piano. It was waiting for the right hands." Those words settled deep in her heart. She had never thought of herself as the kind of person things were made for. Her life had been ordinary, her opportunities small, but the piano didn't care about any of that. It had been broken when she found it, and so had she. In quiet ways, they had mended together, note by note, one autumn afternoon. She was sitting at the piano alone. The window was open, and the sound drifted out into the crisp air. A group of children passed by, their laughter pausing as they listened. One of them whispered, "That's the piano lady." Before running ahead, she smiled to herself, thinking how strange and wonderful it was to be known for something she had once thought was out of her reach. Her students sometimes asked why she kept the old piano when newer ones could sound better. She would run her fingers along the worn edges of the keys and say, "Because this one knows my hands." They didn't always understand, but she knew one day they might. Some instruments carry more than sound, they carry stories, and this one carried hers on quiet nights. After her last student left, and the house grew still, she would sit down and play the very first song she had learned. It wasn't fancy or complicated, but it was hers. Each note felt like a memory. The rainy day she found the shop, the shopkeeper's patient voice, the first time she played. For her family, it was a map of where she had been and how far she had come. Sometimes she imagined what would have happened if she had never stepped into the shop that day, if she had walked past in the rain, never touching the keys, never hearing that first imperfect sound. The thought always made her grateful. Life didn't always give second chances, but sometimes it gave something better, an unexpected beginning. The piano had been built for someone else, decades before she was born. It had survived a flood, years of silence, and being nearly sold to someone who would never play it, but in the end, it had found its way to her. And when her hands touched the keys, it was as if it had been waiting all along. She didn't need to be famous. She didn't need a stage. The music she made here was enough. Every time her fingers moved across the keys, she felt the truth of it. The piano wasn't meant for her, but it was made for her hands. Aftermath. In reflection, the years seemed to move faster after that. Her little living room, once just a quiet corner of family life, became a place where countless songs began. Children grew up here, their small fingers stumbling over the same worn keys she had first touched so many years ago. Some stopped after a few months, but others kept coming back, their skills blooming. Like spring flowers under her careful guidance, the piano aged with her. The scratches in its wood deepened, the yellow of its keys turned softer with time. Every sound it made carried the history of all the hands that had played it. She often thought about how strange it was. This piano had outlasted the shop it came from, outlasted the place where she had first seen it. The music shop had closed. One winter, when the shopkeeper finally retired, on his last visit to her home, he stood beside the piano for a long time. Touching the wood like an old friend, "You kept its voice alive," he told her, and that was the last time they saw each other. Her own life had taken a quiet shape. She never moved away from the town, never sought out the bright lights of a city or a concert hall, but she found a kind of fame in her own way. When people passed her house and heard the music, they knew exactly who lived there. Some would wave from the street, some would stop to listen for a moment before continuing on. The music had become part of the neighborhood, a soft thread woven into the daily life of everyone around. On certain evenings, she would look around her living room and feel the years layered there. The walls had heard laughter, tears, arguments, and celebrations, and through it all, the piano had been steady. It had seen her at her most uncertain and her most certain. It had been there on days when the world felt heavy, and on days when the light seemed to pour in through every window. Sometimes when the house was empty, she would sit alone at the piano and close her eyes. Her fingers would find the first song she had ever learned, slow and familiar. It still carried the same feeling, the same quiet magic she had felt on. That rainy day in the shop, she never played it perfectly, and she never wanted to. Its imperfections were part of its truth, part of hers. Her students often asked her if they should buy newer, better instruments. She would tell them that a good piano is one you can feel, not just one that sounds clean, and then she would tell them the story of her own, how it had once been written. Off as useless, how someone had cared enough to let her play it, and how it had ended up here, in her home, shaping her life in ways she could never have predicted. One evening in late autumn, after her last student had gone home, she sat at the piano longer than usual. The air outside was cool. The street lamps threw soft light into the room. She played without sheet music, letting her hands wander wherever they wished. The song that emerged was a mixture of all the melodies she had carried over the years, parts of her first song, pieces of her students' work, and fragments she had made up on quiet mornings. It was the sound of a life lived with music. When the last note faded, she rested her hands on the keys and stayed there in the silence. She thought about the shopkeeper, about the day he told her the piano was hers. She thought about her students, about the neighbors who stopped to listen. And she thought about herself, the girl who had stepped in from the rain all those years ago with no idea that she was about to find something that would stay with her forever. The piano wasn't meant for her. That was still true. It had been built for someone else, in another time, for another life, but that no longer mattered. It had found its place, and so had she. Every note they had shared had woven them together, until they were impossible to separate. As the evening deepened, she closed the piano lid gently. The room felt full, not with noise, but with the quiet weight of all the years they had shared. She stood, turned off the lamp, and let the soft shadows settle. Outside, the wind carried the first hint of winter. Inside, the piano waited as it always had, ready for the next pair of hands to discover it.